edition. Hey, Joerg, can you see my screen by chance?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I wanted to make sure that the presenter moved. Okay, so tonight we've got Joerg Lew on. He is at Joerg Lew on Twitter, and he's going to be talking about crafting vCenter Orchestrator workflows. A few notes before we get started. There we go. ProfessionalVMware.com is actually running a social media /career survey right now, and kind of the backstory on it is John Frappier and myself, Damien, we were both asked to speak at different vMugs. John's is up in the Northeast, I believe, tomorrow, and I'm going to be speaking at the Seattle one on April 1st. And since both he and I are fairly heavily involved in the community and have been involved in the vBrownbag podcast for a long time, we're both somewhat passionate about how social media can improve your profession, both from a networking perspective, meeting people, making friends, but also giving you the ability to improve your career whenever you can. And so I think last year I had spoken to vMug, and I had done some informal polling among friends via Twitter DM, and it just wasn't a very good data sample. And so this time I decided to put up a Google survey, and I would encourage you, if you haven't done this yet and you have an opportunity, go out to bit.ly/vBrownbag survey and go ahead and take it. It's a fully anonymous survey, but what we're curious about is how social media has impacted your career. And what I mean by that is, did it help you do your current job better? Were you able to get a promotion in your current job? Did you change roles? Did you make more money? Did you get a chance to write a book or speak at vMugs or come on the vBrownbag with all the honor and glory that comes along with that? Sorry, I just can't say that with a straight face. We're fairly realistic and self-deprecating sometimes here. So anyhow, if you have an opportunity, go ahead and take the survey, please. bit.ly/vBrownbag survey. And so on to the regular show notes. You can get in on the conversation at vBrownbag. That is the central vBrownbag Twitter account. We've also got vBrownbag Latam for Latin America, which is Spanish only, as well as vBrownbag EMEA, which is British only, and that's a completely different language from American. You can also follow along on Twitter via the hashtag vBrownbag. You can go to professionalvmware.com/brownbags and take a look at all of our different podcasts and airtimes, as well as download show notes, decks, the videos, etc. And we're also available on iTunes as well, if you weren't already aware. So again, my name is Damien. I'm 6footDad on Twitter. Our guest is Joerg Lew. And Joerg, I'll go ahead and pass you the presenter ball, and feel free to take over.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
All righty. You should have it now.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, you should see my screen now, hopefully, with the PowerPoint up and running.
Not yet, but it should.
Okay. Go to webinar tells me it's showing my screen.
There we go. There's
okay.
a bit of a delay. I'm on my Wi-Fi hotspot here in Palo Alto in a hotel room, so it might just be me.
Okay. Yeah, anyway, it's good for me, so I will keep a bit slow doing my presentation and especially the demos. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to that vBrownbag session. So if I am going to take that survey later on, I will write down that social media made my job much more interesting, because you had a lot of good people and you get the chance to stay awake late at night to present at vBrownbag.
Yeah, indeed. One quick note, and our friend Ahmad just pointed it out via the internal chat here. I had gotten fancy with the capitalization on that bit.ly URL, which is a stupid thing to do because that actually matters with bit.ly. So the actual functional URL is bit.ly/vBrownbag survey, all lowercase. So thanks. Thanks, Irfan.
Okay. Yeah, so today I want to talk about vCenter Orchestrator, obviously. The ones who know me already, well, that's my sort of profession and my passion. So today we will do some pretty advanced stuff in VCO. So for today's session, I am going to start with a very, very quick introduction into workflow development, because I expect you to at least have a glance at VCO already and have a some basic information. If you don't have that, don't worry. I will show you where to get that. We do have a lot of good videos already on there, so to get you started. But today's focus is really on some of the more advanced stuff, because that is something which is right now not really available anywhere else. So this vBrownbag session really is something quite new and contains some material that has not been presented so far to the public. However, it is there, so that's not a big secret. If you are working with VCO, you might be familiar with the different terms, and you might already have seen one or the other topics that we will talk about today. For me, I do have a bunch of slides, but they are mainly for me to keep track of the different topics that we are doing. I also want to do a lot of hands-on demos. So I have an Orchestrator running in a virtual machine on my laptop, and I'm going to connect to that and really develop and run the workflows in a live environment. Most of that is untested, so real men do real demos, no video, pre-recorded videos. That's all live and real. Okay, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them via chat, and I hope that Damien and the other hosts can monitor that and interrupt me if there are some questions. And of course, I try to leave some time at the end of the session for Q&A as well. Okay, well then, let's get started. We are talking about vCenter Orchestrator, which is one of the most powerful tools VMware has in its product portfolio. vCenter Orchestrator, unfortunately, is also one of the, well, best kept secrets we have in our product portfolio. However, it's also one of the products which has the most or the biggest installation base, because it comes with vCenter. So whenever you already have a vCenter server up and running, or you have a vCenter license, then you also already got VCO. In the newer versions, it's even automatically installed on your vCenter server. Alternatively, you can deploy the VCO appliance, which is a out-of-the-box virtual machine, runs very well and is set up in a couple of minutes only. And the good thing is about this VCO appliance, it is really fully supported for production. If you need some more sort of information about what Orchestrator does and how it works and the different deployment methodologies and strategies you have for VCO, then I recommend to browse a little back in the vBrownbag session. We did have another session a couple of weeks ago. I think it was back in December last year, which also got recorded, of course, where I spoke about VCO and VCO introduction and an introduction into how to develop workflows with VCO. In addition to that, so to jump out of my slides here and give you the first reference, I put most, or I will show all you the links that I introduce here on a slide at the end of the presentation, so that you have all that in place. But just for you as a starting point to Orchestrator, on www.vmwarelearning.com/orchestrator, we have published about 2 hours of video material that really starts from point zero. So if you are very new to VCO, this is your starting point. This allows you, in this introductional videos, you get a feeling what VCO is, how to install and configure it, and also a very good introduction how to create workflows and understand how the workflows work. In addition to that, of course, we also offer a 3-day instructor-led training, which is offered by VMware Education. So these are real classroom classes where you have a lot of hands-on labs as well. So this 3-day training is about half of the time lecture and half of the time really hands-on lab to get you started with workflow development. Okay, enough for the advertising. Now let's really get started with the more advanced stuff here. Today I want to talk and demo you a couple of mechanisms and features that are in there in vCenter Orchestrator that you might not have seen before, because they are some advanced topics, but they allow you to really build very, very reliable workflows and really some, let's say, enterprise-ready solutions based on VCO. So first of all, we will start seeing some workflow elements that you might never have used before, like timers or workflow triggers. Then we will talk about exception handling, a very, very powerful mechanism that allows you to build really bulletproof workflows that even can react on errors. We will see how to use the input presentation to make your workflows usable. And we will see how configuration and resource elements can be used in VCO workflows to make the workflows more flexible and more modular, so that you can quite easily export them from your system and share them in the communities, or give them to your customers, or bring them from the development system into the production system. Before doing that, I want to first of all catch up with you. So to make sure that we are all on the same level, I want to give you a very short repetition about how VCO workflow development works and how workflows work from the beginning. So this is something we covered in depth in the last session, last vBrownbag session about VCO. Again, that was, I think, back in December. So feel free to watch the full recording from back then. For VCO, you have the so-called VCO Client, which is a standalone Java application. And this VCO Client connects to your VCO server. So in my case, the VCO server is just a VCO appliance. So you can see it's a virtual machine that runs on my VMware Fusion environment, just on my laptop. And I am, with the VCO client, I'm connected to this Orchestrator server. In the client, first of all, I have the 3 different views for the different use cases to execute workflows, to design workflows, and to administer the environment. When you are building workflows or developing workflows, then you spend most of your time in the design area, because this is really where you have the all the possibilities and the things you need to develop workflows. For that, the difference between the different views here is just the different tabs you can see in the navigation pane on the left-hand side. And I'm going to go into the design view. So in Orchestrator, you have your workflow library, which is a tree structure containing different folders and different workflows in these folders. So when you have an Orchestrator that has a lot of plugin installed, and you can see in the workflow library that is filled by all these different plugins, you can see a lot of workflows coming out of the box in there. So for example, with every VCO you get a plugin for vCenter that allows you to automate tasks in vCenter, and with that vCenter plugin there come hundreds of workflows for all possible common tasks in vCenter. So for example, you have the very basic workflows, of course, to do some power operations for virtual machines. To clone virtual machines, there's a whole bunch of workflows in there for the different cloning scenarios. By the way, including some very interesting workflows to create link clones using Orchestrator. So that is something which is, for a good reason, not visible in the vSphere client, but since the vCenter API allows to create these link clones via the API, well, you can build workflows, and you can see even in the library there are some workflows that allow you to create link clones very quickly. So when you get started with VCO, the library usually is your first place to look at, because this is where you can find already might fit your needs. If they don't, then it's quite easy to either adjust these workflows or wrap them into your own workflows. So, for example, for all the workflows in the library, you can always do right-click and then duplicate the workflow to your own folder. So to make a copy of that workflow and copy that into your own workflow folder, which in my case I called vBrownbag demo down here, and then you have a copy of that workflow, and then you can really edit this workflow and adjust the settings, the attributes, and adjust the flow of the workflow, the different steps, and so on. Now, in our case, just to give you a short repetition about how Orchestrator workflows work, I want to create a bit of a hello world example. This is, by the way, I think the same example I did in the last session, and it's also on the video, so I will not spend too much time on that. I, in my workflow folder, create a new workflow, call it personal hello world, and this workflow is intended to ask the user, the workflow caller, for his first name and the last name, and then combine them to the full name and print them out. So in the workflow schema, you do have the different workflow elements on the left-hand side. We'll talk about in depth in a couple of minutes. And then you just drag and drop these workflow elements to your workflow schema. So in our case, to do that hello world, I do have two scriptable tasks, which contain some JavaScript logic. And the first one is to combine the greeting line, and the second one will be to print out the greeting. Print the greeting line. And for that, since I want to ask the workflow caller for his first name and the last name, I need to define some input parameters for this workflow. Two input parameters, one for the first name and one for the last name. Remember that VCO uses strict typing, so you always have to define a type for an attribute or a parameter in the workflow. These types, by the way, are either plain data types, like a number or a string or a board. These types are provided by the different plugins. So the vCenter plugin brings in all the types that are there in the vSphere API. Install the vCloud Automation Center plugin. You get all the different objects in the vCloud. You get a REST host and a REST operation as object type, for example. So all these types come from the plugin. And as you can see, when you install a lot of plugins in my VCO, I have quite a full list of plugins in there. I have over 600 different object types available. Okay, in my case, since first name and last name just should be a string, we can keep it with the string. Now, what I want to do here is now to use these first name and last name in the first workflow element, and so I have to do the so-called parameter binding. And this parameter binding is a very crucial part to understand how VCO works. That's the reason why I repeat this in the session. So you have to make sure that this single first workflow element we are working on can use the workflow attributes or parameters. So in the in-binding, I define my two parameters and bind these two workflow parameters as in parameters to my workflow element. And that means they are now exposed into JavaScript as JavaScript variables, and I can do now something like my full greeting line equals the first name plus space in the middle plus the last name and semicolon at the end. So this is now a full JavaScript line that concatenates these both strings and save them into a local variable called full greeting line. And since I want to print out that full greeting line in the next workflow element, I have to do an out binding with that full greeting line and bind that to a workflow attribute. Right now I don't have a workflow attribute yet, so I create a new one, which is called the full line. It's also type string. I cannot provide a value in here. And if I click to OK now, three things happen in background. So this wizard will create for me a workflow attribute called full line. It will, well, it will not pass any value to that workflow attribute because I don't know that value yet, and it will do the binding to the element. So just to prove that it's there, we have the full line now as parameter, which means I have to correct here my identifier for the full line. And in the visual binding, you can see we have that binding. So the local variable is bound to the workflow attribute. And in the general tab of the workflow, you can see that the wizard created for me this workflow attribute. And then in my second element, I can use this again, now to see that it even works per drag and drop. I just drag and drop the attribute here to create that input binding. So this input binding has now been created, and I can do some system.log and just print out the string hello and my full line. Wait a second to make sure that the syntax is correct, and I close the workflow, and I will save and close the workflow. Continue anyway, don't want to increase the version here, and then I can run the workflow. And since my workflow now has two input parameters, it asks me for my first name and the last name, and if I click submit, let's see what happens. The workflow runs very quickly to the end. It creates a new workflow token on the left hand side, and in the logs you can see the printed out full greeting line. In the variable step, by the way, you can see the concatenated workflow attribute as well. So this was a very short repetition about parameter binding and how VCO works. If you want to have more on that, look at the videos at vmwarelearning.com and look at the recording of our last vBrownbag session back in December. I hope it was December, but I think so.
Hey, Joerg. So Cody is online, but he's kind of a little bit under the dentist weather right now. And he had asked me to ask you to mention the version number thing. Do you know what that's referring to?
Oh, yeah. So that means the version number is the version number that you can see in the general tab of the workflow. So this version number only can be increased. And if I change something in my workflow, like let's say I increase the version now to the initial release, I just hit the click to one of the digits here, and it gets increased from 0.0.0 to 0.0.1. And I can put in my comment here for the initial release and save that workflow, or save and close the workflow. Then you can see it also allows you to automatically increase the version with every save and close, but I want to do it manually to really show it here to you. So we have version 0.0.1 now, and if I now added something and, for example, add another scriptable task to do some other mighty things in there, entity things. Yeah, you get the idea. Then I can increase the version again. Put in some new comment and save and close my workflow again. I got a validation error because the script is empty. But anyway, now you can see the version has increased, and in the version history, and that's now the cool thing as of VCO 5, you have the whole history about what happened in the workflow. And now the really cool thing is that you even can do a diff against the current version. So you get a new window here, which usually you make a bit larger, where you can see on the left-hand side your current 0.0.2 version, and on the right-hand side the older version. And then you even can see the differences, what happened in that workflow. And that also even for, you can have a look at the different content here to compare the script content. So it's a very, it allows you to very deeply inspect the same workflow, but the different versions of the workflow to see, yeah, how the workflow got developed and got evolved. And you even can jump back to the old version. So that works a bit like snapshots for virtual machines. When you revert to an older version, you might lose all the differences between the last version and the current state. So that's the same as you would do a revert to snapshot for a virtual machine, for example. So this is a very, very useful functionality to keep track of what you do. Of course, it is not a fully blown version control system for concurrent development. So if you are a software developer and you are used to Subversion or to GitHub, then this is very, very basic what we have in VCO, but at least we have something, and we can do a diff, and we can jump back to older versions, and well, that's a very good thing. Oh, by the way.
So Joerg, I've got some questions here for you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hang on one second. I'm responding to a question from Graham. Can you see the questions and answers from sometimes folks have?
Give me a second. I can.
Let me make you an organizer. If you've got one monitor, it may not work as well as if you are able to have two and kind of keep the questions on the side.
I just have one orchestrator. One orchestrator. Oh my God, it's too late. I just have
just one monitor.
One screen, yeah, one monitor.
Okay, no worries. No worries.
Can see some questions.
A couple questions here. I had answered this already, but for the sake of the audience and also in order to take advantage of the expertise you have, which is way more than mine, Graham Mitchell has a question asking, can you only use JavaScript?
Yeah, you only can use JavaScript.
And that's for the creation of the workflows themselves.
That's for the creation of the workflows. However, the workflows themselves, they can call out to existing Perl scripts, to existing PowerShell scripts. We even have a PowerShell plugin available that makes that a bit easier. So for the creation within VCO, it's JavaScript only, but from within the workflows, you can call out to whatever you want, whatever you have on existing scripts or automation functionality.
Thank you. Next question up is from Ernest Sadat, and the question is, when do you use VCO and when do you use PowerShell?
Well, if it's me, I just use VCO. No, just kidding. Usually,
I'm sure Al has a different answer for that one.
Yeah,
and of course,
absolutely.
William Land is completely different.
Yeah, oh yeah. VCO, PowerShell, there is Perl.
Exactly.
Yeah, so with PowerShell, usually you can get very quick results because you just Google what you are looking for, and then you likely find some script that almost is there, what you do, by Luke Deakins or by Alan. So for PowerShell, you usually get very quick results. For the Orchestrator workflows, that's more if you want to do these automations or make them enterprise ready. So if you want to scale them, if you want to make them error-proof, if you want to run them on a regular base using the workflow scheduler, all of that, this is what VCO gives you. And we do have a lot of users out there that actually use VCO to call out to their old existing PowerShell scripts. So it's not either the one or the other. There is also a very good collaboration of these different tools.
So a follow-up question from Ernest. This might be a trick question. Is VCO for VMware admins or for developers?
Oh, that is a trick question, indeed.
Tricky,
so,
Ernest.
I would say even for VMware administrators, you can make your life much easier by automating the stupidest tasks you usually have to do manually. But you have to have at least a bit of a, let's say, scripting know-how to get the knowledge about what variables are, the concept of typing and so on, and modularization to build workflows. So we usually, we see, let's do it this way, we see Orchestrator in 3 different categories of customers or users. First of all, we have the people who are quite new to VCO. These are usually customers that really start using VCO to automate their day-to-day tasks. So here, really, the vSphere administrator starts the workflow and build the workflow for their mainly tasks like, finding old snapshots and all the typical stuff that you do as an administrator day-to-day base. Then we have the customers who have used VCO all over the place for a long, long time. So they really are more the developer side, and they build their complete, they automate their complete IT processes using VCO. And then in a very rising number of projects, we use VCO not mainly as an automation, but more as an integration tool that allows us or the customer or service partners to integrate tools like vCloud Director or vCloud Automation Center to any other existing piece of the IT infrastructure. So I would say VCO is a tool for both for vSphere admins to make their life easier, to automate day-to-day tasks, but it is also a tool for really developer to build very powerful and fully blown solutions for automating complete IT processes.
So I did want to mention, I know that Joerg mentioned the session that he did in mid-December of 2013 about the introduction to a vCenter Orchestrator. I just tweeted from the vBrownbag Twitter account and also on the hashtag the URL to the session on professionalvmware.com. If for whatever reason you're not on Twitter, which is cool, you can just go to professionalvmware.com. We've got a vBrownbag automation track right there in the top menu. You can go there and you can find Joerg's VCO introduction from December that might help with some of the more introductory questions around what it does and how it fits into the overall orchestration and automation tool chain that is available via VMware as well as a number of other open source things out there. Let's see. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you here, this is from Ashley Williams, and feel free to work it into the general flow of the presentation here, Joerg. I don't want you to skip ahead if it's not the next thing on the list. But Ashley's question is, let me get back to it. Can you demonstrate or can you talk how to string multiple workflows together where inputs and outputs can be passed between workflows?
Yes, I can do that. So
cool.
That's absolutely possible. I'm just thinking, give me a second, about a use case that I can actually do in my lab, but I might have an idea. Yeah. So let's take that workflow that we actually created. So we have that workflow that prints out the first name and the last name. And let's say we do have another workflow that fetches this information from a database. So that might be a bit of a strange story here, but I don't really have a complete vSphere environment, so we cannot really do some automation on vCenter in my small laptop here. But to give you the idea, let's say we have another workflow that just gets the first name of someone from a database, for example. So this workflow has no input parameters. It just has some logic, and you can use the database plugin to really implement that solution. I do have a video for that as well, so a very good follow-up on what I'm demonstrating now. So in my case, I will just hard code the first name and do something like first name equals Joerg, and to make sure that this is now really created as an, or can be used by others, I have to do the outbinding, and this time not to a workflow attribute, but to a workflow output parameter. So let's create a new parameter, which is called the first name, or let's say the first name from database. Imagine that we get that from a database here. And now I don't want to have that as a workflow attribute, but as a workflow output parameter. And click to OK here, and click to close here. And then you can see that we have a workflow output parameter here. And if I now validate my workflow, that should be valid. I save and close and ignore that message for now. If I run that workflow now, it doesn't do anything, or it does not. It does something. It does not log out anything, but it should fill out. Oh, good point. It should fill out the variable here, this output parameter. It doesn't do that because they are named in a different way. So here I have my first name from database, and this is exactly how this should name. You can see the different pink color if you really match it to a parameter. So let's try this again and run the workflow again. And now you can see the value is really filled, and I will duplicate that workflow because I want to do something for the last name as well to get the full picture here. And for the last name, I am going to edit, of course, my hard-coded value in here to see the difference. I will rename that to last name. I will make sure that I rename this guy here to last name as well. Double check that it's pink again. And I will make sure that my output parameter is called different. So that's not the first name anymore, but the last name. And save and close this workflow and let this workflow run again. So this is also filled with my last name. That is fine. So what we now have, we have two workflows that have some logic in there to get the first name, get the last name. And I want to bring all these three guys together in one big workflow. So let's say the personal hello world is a library workflow we have, as it would be a create simple virtual machine workflow. And for my workflow, I have to provide a first name and last name. For creating a virtual machine, I have to define a virtual machine name and a data store, for example. And you want to put some other workflows in front of that to get these parameters. And for that, I build a new one, which is a, I don't know, fully automated hello world. And in this workflow, I will now not use my scriptable tasks, but I want to use some of the existing workflows. So I can either drag and drop a workflow element in here, and if I remember the name, I can search for the workflow name. Oh, I do have a lot of hello worlds in here, so yeah, I want to cancel that because nicely you have also the all workflows tab here, where you really have again your workflow library, and then you just drag and drop the workflow that you want to call here. So I want to call my personal hello world at the end. What you can see here is this setup button, which I recommend you to not use if you start with VCO, because in this setup button you can do a lot of things with just one promote mouse click. However, you really have to make sure to understand what happens when you click on that promote button. Otherwise, the wizard will create a lot of mess, and you will spend a lot of more time cleaning up the mess than you would have to spend if you really do all the things manually. So for now, I do not use that wizard. That is for experienced people to save some time, but to understand what happens and what we have to do, I really go through that step by step. So this workflow, you know that workflow, it has two input parameters, so it expects us to set the first name and the last name. And we have to provide this first name and the last name. So we have to make sure that to figure out where does this information come from. And in our case, I want to call the other workflows, the get first name and the get last name workflow first. So that means I drag and drop my get first name in here. Again, I do not use the setup button, and I see that the get first name has one output parameter, which is exactly the first name, and I have to do the binding here. So I have to somehow transfer that information that comes from the first workflow, from executing the first workflow, and transfer this to my second workflow. And now, as a very important concept in VCO, you can never ever transfer information directly from one workflow element to another workflow element, but you have to sort of write that back to the workflow. So I have to create, in my general tab, I have to create a workflow attribute that stores the information while the workflow is running. So I create a workflow attribute for my first name, which is of type string, and I will create another one, which is called last name, which is also of type string, which we need later, and then I do the binding. So the first one, to get the first name, I will bind that to my first name attribute. Double check in the visual binding. So that this one, now you see the direction of the small arrows here. It writes the value into the workflow attribute. And for the second element, the workflow that the personal hello world workflow that I call in my workflow, I do the same vice versa. So I bind that now in the in tab as input parameter, my first name. And double check the binding again. So on the left hand side you see the workflow attributes, and it's now sort of provided, written, or read from the workflow, read from the workflow attribute here to the local element. And I'm going to do the same thing with the last name. So drag and drop that here and do the binding manually, this time using drag and drop again to see it's the same as I would click on the not set button in the out tab. So you can either drag and drop, or you can click here and select the one. Both do the same, they do this binding. And for my personal hello world, I have to do the in binding again for the other one. So either click here to not set and select the last name, or drag and drop it here and double check in the in binding. And now I have the full data flow configured in my workflow. So these two guys fill the workflow attributes. So they fill the value while the workflow is running. They fill the value in there. And then the last workflow element, or the other workflow I call, reads these attributes and prints them out. So let's give that a try. I save the workflow, and nicely in 5.5 you can run the workflow directly from here, which saves a lot of clicking time. So if I now run that workflow, you can see it runs very, very quickly because and it asks not any questions because there are no input parameters there, because we generate all the information in the workflow. You can see that the 2 workflow attributes are filled, and you can see hopefully in the logs that's the output now from the last workflow element. Now I think it makes sense to spend some more time on this to really, because that really very good explains how VCO works. So what you can do, and this is now the nice thing in 5.5, also show you some new feature. Let's toggle the breakpoint here and set the breakpoint here, because that means I can now not run the workflow from left to right in one pick without interruption, but I can even debug the workflow. So that means if I run the debug now, then my workflow again starts from the beginning, and as you can see, it stops at the first workflow element. And you, on the right-hand side, you have your variables. So this tab shows you all the workflow inputs and outputs. We don't have them here, but it also shows the workflow attributes and their values. So at the beginning, the values of the first name and the last name workflow attribute are empty. If I now, I could step into that to see what the first workflow does. Let's do this. So step into this one. So it runs that scriptable task. It executes that scriptable task. You can see that in this sub-workflow now, the output parameter is filled. And if I get to the next step, it jumps back to the overall workflow. And now you can see for the overall workflow at this time, the first name attribute is filled. And the same works if I dig into here for the second workflow I call, the second element here, which fills the other attribute. And then, well, it goes to the third workflow element in my overall workflow, which now calls out to the personal hello world workflow, providing these 2 parameters. And if I dig into here, you can also see different steps here to print out. And now that I've printed out, I should see the log field. And the last step does not do anything here. And then if I go back, I also have to sort of execute the end stuff. And now my workflow has completely run step by step. You can see the variables filled, and you can see the logs written. Okay, and now even to, it's not really what I've planned, but anyway, I want to show, to really make sure that you get that concept, because this is very important. This is the key concept of how VCO works. I want to go back to the whiteboard and explain in a bit of different point of view what we've done right now, to really make sure that everybody gets the idea here of the parameter binding. So I jump over to my virtual whiteboard and want to do some drawing in here. So we can see we have that workflow from the beginning. It does call out the first workflow element, get the first name. It does call after that the other workflow, the second workflow element, to get the last name. And then it calls that personal hello world that prints out the first name and the last name. And then the workflow ends. And what we have done now, this is now part of the whole workflow that we built. So in our workflow, we call out to 3 different other workflows, each of which has, when you remember, just these guys just have 1 workflow step in there. And the third one, the hello world, you remember it has the 2 workflow steps in there. Forget about my mighty addition here. And whenever the overall workflow comes to that place, it executes the other workflows as a sub-workflow. And what we've done here now, imagine our personal Hello World workflow. This workflow uses as input parameters the attributes for the first name and the last name and prints them out to the log file. So we have to somehow fill that, and to fill that, we created these other workflows. They both have, let's do this in this way, they both have output parameters that generates these names and write them. And now to pass this information within our overall workflow from one element to another element, we have to create these workflow attributes here in our overall workflow for the first name and the last name. And to do the binding now, that's what we've done, is that the first workflow generates the first name and writes that into the workflow attribute. The second workflow that we call in our overall workflow creates the last name and writes that into this workflow element, workflow attribute. And then our third workflow element uses both of them. So we did the parameter binding as well. So let's jump over here and reads the values from these workflow attributes. So you can imagine the workflow attributes are sort of, I don't want to use the term global variables because that might be misleading, but these are some variables for each workflow instance. And they have to be filled by the different elements, and they can be read from the different elements. So this is sort of a write binding. It's an out binding here from this one, and this other one is a read binding because it's an in binding to that last element. And the same here. The first guy writes or sets the value, it writes this value, and the other one, the other workflow element reads from that value again. Now, you might want to ask, why is that so complicated? And the reason for this is this key concept of Orchestrator allows Orchestrator to be very, very reliable, because having these parameter bindings, it allows the workflow engine to do a so-called checkpointing. So if you imagine we have our timeline here from left to right. So this is now 2:20 a.m. And we have here our, I don't know, the workflow runs within seconds, but you get the idea, 2:25 a.m. When you start the workflow, and it runs from left to right, then after each workflow element, VCO, the VCO platform, does a so-called checkpointing. So that means at this step, when the workflow reaches the end of the first element, the complete attributes stack of the workflow, so the complete inputs, outputs, if they set already, and the workflow attributes are stored into the VCO database. And are sort of read again for the next workflow element. And when this next workflow element is finished, then again, at this time, again, all the complete workflow stack, all the runtime information of that workflow instance is again stored in the VCO database table. So that means with that so-called checkpointing, the VCO database has always the full information that is needed to resume the workflow from that place. So if you imagine you have a long-running workflow and your server crashes somewhere here at this time, and you restart the server, then all the information that is needed to resume the workflow at this time is stored in the database. And when the VCO server restarts, you can configure that per workflow. It might automatically even resume the workflow and just continuing with the next step without losing any information. And this is the reason why you can build such reliable workflows and reliable solutions based on VCO workflows. And on the other hand, this also means that we have to do all these, sort of maybe confusing things with the parameter bindings. But once you get that concept, and I hope the time we spend, or I spend now explaining that on the whiteboard and doing that step by step helps you with that, really to get that key concept of VCO.
That's awesome. This is the first podcast that I have hosted where we actually did a virtual whiteboard like this. It's pretty great. What application is that? Oh, Sketchbook Pro.
That's Sketchbook Pro, yeah, and a Wacom tablet, which takes half of my desk at home. But yeah.
So I've got a couple questions here from Graham Mitchell and Stacy Carter. First up from Graham, he's got 3 here. Can you pass objects like virtual machines and such between workflows?
Yeah, you can. So going back to the actual VCO and see what we have in the workflow attributes. And as mentioned, these can be plain data types, but these also can be complex data types like a vCenter virtual machine, which is somewhere up here. So you can pass all these sort of objects between the different workflow elements, including virtual machines, including whatever you want. To cheat, there is even a any type here, which is a bit of a cheating, and you should use that very, very carefully because it breaks the strict typing that we have. You can also specify any type if you're not sure what to pass there yet, but yeah, be careful with that.
Okay. Next up, how deep can workflows nest?
There is no limit for that. If we run that workflow,
there might be a sanity limit.
Yeah, let me explain. Let's do another full hello world here, and to make sure they run very quickly, so I do another ones. When you run these workflows as synchronous workflows, so if you use that synchronous call the other workflow element, for that other workflow, you will not see a workflow execution. So if you look at the time here, these were my test executions. I did at 8:02, and you do not see any special executions for this get first name workflow from my overall workflow. So when you call that workflow, which calls the other workflows synchronously, you only get an execution, one execution framework, and the depth you have here is only limited by your memory of the Java virtual machine. Because again, remember, to do the checkpointing, that counts also for all the sub workflows. That means if you call 5 workflows, not in a row, but one workflow within another, the complete attribute stack from all of these workflows always have to be stored in the database, and of course also in the memory. But that should not hinder you to or limit you in building nicely solutions, because this is actually a very important question, because since we have no limitations, it allows you to build workflows in a very modular way and reuse what you have in a lot of different contexts. Great question.
So a follow-on question to that, are attributes only in scope within that workflow?
Very good question again. Nice.
Way to go, Graham.
Yeah, perfect. So here the answer is yes. So for the workflow attributes are only in scope of each single workflow instance. If I run that workflow twice at the same time, which I can do if I'm fast enough yeah, you can imagine you have a workflow that runs for longer than a second. Then you can run up to 300 workflows at the same time, by the way, which is the supported limit. So you can run multiple workflows, and you can even run multiple instances of the same workflow at the same time. But the workflow attributes are only visible to that single instance of that workflow. If you want to pass information from one workflow instance to another workflow instance, then you either have to use an external database or an external file or the resource or configuration elements. I think there was lately a discussion on the VMware communities in the Orchestrator sections about exactly this question.
Awesome. So I've got a couple other questions here from Stacy Carter. Stacy, if you want to be unmuted, just raise your hand within the webinar, and I can. But in the interim, two of her questions. Let's see. One of them is regarding the workflow restart checkbox that you were showing earlier, and she wants to know if you have to configure that at the workflow level.
Yeah, so for that, you have to configure that at the workflow level, and there are two settings actually to do here. The first one is what should happen if the server restarts. So if your VCO server crashes while the workflow is running, then the default setting is to resume the workflow run, and you can disable that if you want to have that. It makes sense for some workflows where it does not make sense to resume them after a server restart, but the default here is to really resume the workflows automatically. But you can set that on a per workflow level. Do not confuse that with the other one. The other one is what should happen if the workflow runs into an error. And then you can also do some resuming, so to set that workflow not to the state failed, but to the answer state where you can manually resume that workflow. But for all the checkpointing and all the discussion I did, the server restart behavior, this is what you're interested in. And per default, workflows do automatically resume, but you can change that per workflow.
And she also has a plugin question. I don't know if it's appropriate to ask it now or if you want to hold the question until a little bit later in your presentation.
Well, go ahead. I don't know how much time we have.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, how much
go ahead with the question.
Mr. Middle of the Night. So her question is, it relates to the Orchestrator 5.5 AD plugin. And she wants to know if you can point it to more than one domain, and if so, how do you make workflows use a certain one?
Oh, sorry, time's up. I'm sorry. No, just kidding. Just kidding. This is, I think, one of the most requested features for the Active Directory plugin. And even in the 5.5 version, if I'm not completely wrong, you cannot point it to multiple Active Directories. Still, just to a single one. What you can do as a workaround, it allows you to configure that domain programmatically within a workflow. So if you want to do it the very scary way, you could reconfigure the plugin each time you need to connect to a different domain. But for that, be very, very careful with concurrency and multiple workflows hitting the same step. So that's only a very dirty workaround you do not want to use at all, honestly. But I can assure you that this feature is on the topmost list for our next version of the AD plugin, hopefully, because there are every single customer is asking for that.
Yeah, I bet. So I've got another question here from Suresh that was asked earlier on in the podcast. So Suresh, if I've got the scope of the question wrong, just let me know. But the question is, can you clone an older version to a new workflow? And I'm assuming the question is, can you clone an older version of a workflow into a new workflow?
Yeah, that would be nice, but unfortunately, it's not possible. So if we have, even if we have multiple workflow, multiple versions, there is unfortunately no right-click here and no clone button. It would make sense, absolutely, I'm with you, but it's not possible right now.
Okay. I did want to point out something here just based on personal experience with vCenter Orchestrator. I was recently involved in a project, long story, but we were limited to the version of Orchestrator that we could use. And the version at the time, UUID field, which can make it a little bit difficult if you're trying to identify executions of specific workflows. Mm-hmm. So you can get the newer stuff where you actually have the UUID, and that'll make your life easier when it comes to REST API.
Yeah, I can give you, I hope it works on a Mac, 33 for older versions, which I cannot really show you, but I can tell you what I'm doing. So if you press Control-C or Command-C for copy, just while selecting on the left-hand side the workflow, and then you paste that into your main editor or whatever you have. Give me a second. And you paste that here. Yeah, it does not work on my Mac, but it works on a Windows version. So if you Control-C and Control-V, copy and paste it to an editor, then you get the XML representation of that workflow, which contains the ID as well. And that works in older versions as well. Very helpful, undocumented feature. Wow,
I wish I would have hollered at you instead of beating my brains against Google. Although
happy to help for the next time.
Yeah, the VCO team website was also extraordinarily helpful with helping me understand how to, basically take a look at workflows that I had run within the Orchestrator UI, to look at the XML or the JSON details of that execution, be able to replicate that again via REST. So there's actually a really good article out there. There's a lot of information about Orchestrator. It's based on what I know internally, working for EMC and my discussions with VMware, Orchestrator is only going to continue to be more and more a part of the orchestration and automation stack.
Yeah, absolutely. So
yeah. So I've got another question here from Ashley, and the question is: can you export workflows and actions as a module/package?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you can do with every single workflow is, and I can show you. Yep, you can right-click and export the workflow, and then export that to whatever you want to have, or whatever local folder where the VCO client runs. It exports in a single .workflow file, which is a zip file that contains a lot of XML stuff, by the way. So you can export a single workflow or a single action. However, when you do this, there are no dependencies checked. So you only get the workflow, which might be useful for a workflow like this that only contains scriptable tasks. It is not useful for a workflow like this that contains other workflows. So only use it really for simple workflows. For the other ones, we have the packaging feature, and this is something I have to show you because that allows you to build complete modules of solutions. So these packages, they contain workflows, actions, policies, configuration, resources, everything that is needed to run a workflow. So you can create a new package. Package is just a logical structure. vBrownbag, rv.com, or anyway. Yeah, so you create a new package, and as always, press Control-E or right-click and edit to edit the package, and then you can add your workflow either by selecting a complete workflow folder or a complete single workflow, or you can also select a single workflow, and in my case, I think I named it Fully Automated Hello World. Yeah, this was it. And when I select this, then you can see it automatically checks all the dependencies and even all the dependencies of these workflows again, and fills all the necessary actions. We don't have one here, but if we would call an action, it would be placed here. If it would use a configuration or resource element, everything that is used to run these workflows is now in that package. And then you can save and close and export the complete package. make sure if you change something, there is the rebuild package, that button that checks again the dependencies and put everything in there what's needed. And then you can export the package, which is here. And again, you can export that to a single package file. And this package file is then something you can provide to your customers, to your production environments, to your colleagues, or share it in the communities. So if we go, as an example, to the communities, which I should have here. If you go to the VMware communities, there is the vCenter Orchestrator section, which of course has a lot of discussions. And as you can see, there are usually almost none of the questions unanswered. So a very active community. I absolutely recommend you to read through that and ask your questions. Very, very helpful. Me and my colleagues are very active there, by the way. But very important on that, you also have the document section where other people use exactly that packaging functionality to share their workflows. So if you can see there are almost 100 examples of workflows, usually packages out there. So for example, that guest script manager package that helps you to run scripts in guest operating systems. The download is this one, which, it's this one. So as you can see, it is the package file. And this package file, when you got that downloaded from the communities or sent to you via email, then you use, again, in your Orchestrator client, the way around. So that button to import the package. And then you select your package file, which I'm quite sure I have quite something in my downloads here. So let's say this VCD notifications package, which is exactly one that we have in the communities. And you can see, you can even sign them and do all the certificates to make sure that they work. And you can see you also get some version control here. It uses the versions to compare on the left-hand side what's in the package, the right-hand side what's on your server, and allows you to select only the workflows you need. So in my case, I already imported that package before, so I don't have to import anything. If you use that package for the first time, it will tick all these checkboxes which are new. So you have that version control as well. And then you hit the import selected elements, and it imports the package and imports all these workflows and all their dependencies. So here, for example, there are some actions, there are configurations in there. So the packages feature, this is the way to go to build your solutions and to share your solutions with others.
And I apologize if I missed this, but did you cover on signing when you export?
No, I didn't cover, because I rarely use that. But where's my demo? There's a lot of V in here, vBrownbag. So when you export the package, then you can, the package is automatically signed with the certificate of that VCO server, and that is shown when you import the package as well. You can even encrypt the package with a certificate of the target server to make sure that the packages can only be imported on that single specific other server. So there is some sort of intellectual property securing mechanisms in there as well. By default, the package is already signed with the certificate of my VCO instance, and if I import that again, I think it was there, was my Brownbag demo package, then you can see now the information about that source server, where it came from. And you can import that. Done. Okay. Any other questions so far?
Yeah. Sorry, I
yeah,
don't know
of course.
if we're waiting on something. So I've got a question here from Suresh about a beta feature. Is that something that you might be able to answer?
I can try.
Okay. Just, didn't want to like break NDA or anything, but the question is asking if you can explain dynamic types.
Well, my alarm clock is ringing in about 3 hours from now. We do not break any NDAs because this is public available in the latest version of VCO, which is 5.5.1,
Okay, cool.
which just got released 3 days ago, or last week. So yeah, eventually last week. So it is marked as beta. It is a beta feature, but it's public available. Yeah, this dynamic types, in short, they allow you to create inventory objects that your workflows can operate on without developing a plugin. Usually, to provide all these inventory objects, you have to develop a VCO plugin, which is Java development using Eclipse, compiling the plugin, writing XML files, using Spring Toolkit, and implementing Java. So you need really Java developer skills to develop a plugin. The dynamic types allow you to define these object types and the structure. So the tree structure that you have some main types and some children children objects and relations between them without using Java and without using the developing really a VCO plugin. However, they are not really that intuitive because you have to build all these, let's say the components you need in a plugin. You just build them in JavaScript. So that's the main advantage of the dynamic types, that you don't have to develop a plugin, but you still have to know how a plugin works. So you have to manually, within JavaScript and within workflows, you have to define the finders. You have to define how the object structure works from the root element to the children element, to find all the relations, to find them by ID, and so on. So I think on vcoteam.info, we have, my colleagues, Christoph has published an article about tagging and dynamic types, and that is, yeah, I guess quite exactly the same basic level. But let's say it in this way, expect some more as the feature matures and goes out of beta, and maybe even before that we might do some other either vBrownbag sessions or blog articles about how to use the dynamic types as well. They are quite powerful, but it's not that easy to use them.
Cool. So I just wanted to put this out here, semi-shameless promotion, although since I didn't write the book, I guess can't really be shameless. But Cody actually wrote a book about vCenter Orchestrator a while back, and it's available on Amazon. And yep. It is titled Automating vSphere with VMware vCenter Orchestrator. It's a VMware Press book. It's available on Kindle. It's available as a dead tree version. If you go to Amazon and search for vCenter Orchestrator, it's the top hit. Other hits show up.
It's sort of the only hit.
Yes, the one and the only. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you should definitely take a look at it if you're interested in the 101 kind of thing and some things deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to make sure, even if the book is, well, you can somewhere see it, it is quite old for IT 2012, and it is written for an older version of VCO 4.2. The concepts that are explained in the book are still valid, because even if right now we do have a new client, so it looks a bit different, the look and feel is a bit different, but the concept of that parameter binding and the examples and everything that explained in the book is still valid. So even if you might find yourself with a bit of different view when using a current version of VCO, the client looks different, but the concepts and the main idea about how workflows work, and I think most of the examples explained in the book are still working and are still very valid.
Awesome. Thank you. So it looks like we've got all the questions answered,
Perfect.
both within the webinar interface and on Twitter. Does anybody have anything else for Joerg? Feel free to raise your hand or shoot a message on the chat feature. You know, I never know what to call it. I don't think I've ever attended it as a non-presenter or an organizer, and of course there's a different interface based on your roles. I don't really know the actual name of it, so I apologize if it's kind of a Dirk thing. Okay, here's another question from Suresh. Suresh wants to know, is it possible to run just the action without adding to the workflow?
No, it's not. You always have to build a workflow around that. There are technically some that's not complete correct, because actions can be executed as part of the input presentation of a workflow. So the question or the form that is exactly this form, you can automate that and put some dynamic in there by calling actions, and then technically these actions are executed without having a workflow instance up and running at this time yet. But in general, actions have to be wrapped into a workflow to be executed. There is no, if you have an action somewhere here, there is no right-click and run the action. However, if I, spoiler alert, so if I tell that now I am working on some workflow packages that allow you to automatically create these wrapper workflows around these actions to test them. So expect something within the next couple of weeks, let's say it this way, on our blogs to help creating these workflows to test actions. Per se, actions cannot be directly executed.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, I think that covers all the questions that I'm seeing. I'm not seeing anything else on Twitter or via the webinar.
Very good.
So thank you very much for your time, Joerg. For folks, in case you didn't catch it before, you can follow Joerg on Twitter. He is at Joerg Lew. That is JOERGLEW. And you can also follow the vCenter Orchestrator folks at VCO Team, I believe. Is that right, Joerg?
Yeah, and vcoportal.de, that's my blog. And there are a lot of more blogs out there. So as usual, you can find them. On Twitter,
yes,
it's the hashtag VCO where you can find us.
Cool, cool. And just in case you didn't catch it, I think I might have been talking over the top of him. Joerg's blog is vcoportal.de, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great, cool. All righty, well, thank you very much, Joerg. It's been a great podcast, and it's run long, but I think it's been absolutely fantastic and full of a lot of information. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Make sure to check out the hands-on labs that we provide, labs.hol.vmware.com. There are some labs in there that contain Orchestrator tasks as well, so that might be a very easy way for you to get started. Otherwise, download the appliance, set it up. It's up and running within 5 minutes, and then make sure to get started with the videos on, I had them somewhere in there. Yeah, you get the idea. The Orchestrator videos, yeah, and all the other resources we have for to get started with VCO. If you have any questions, the communities are the way to go. You will get very quick answers usually.
I have one more quick question from Josh Andrews, and that question is, why the appliance versus the installed server?
Well, officially, appliance are our future strategy for everything. So the appliance is up and running very quickly. It has no limitations in terms of support. It's fully supported for production, and it has no limitations in functionality. So if you are new to VCO, use the appliance. if you already have a vCenter installed and want to use the VCO installed there, then of course you are also fine to use it on Windows, but there is no drawback to use the appliance. And even in our own vCloud Automation Center, we also use the appliance sort of strategy for VCO as well.
Yeah, the one that's bundled with VCAC is the same as the standalone appliance, as long as you're on the right versions, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. One more question from Suresh. Is there best practice to use when integrating the workflow with vSphere Web Client?
Can you repeat this question, please?
Best practice to use when integrating the workflows with the vSphere Web Client?
Yeah, so the vSphere Web Client is one possible UI for the workflows. There are no real best practices. You have to get it to work. That might be a bit challenging. So you have to make sure that vCenter is configured for single sign-on. You have to make sure that VCO is configured for single sign-on, that the times are in sync, and a lot of other things that we have a very famous article, I guess, on the communities as well. So somewhere in these docs you can find about a document about troubleshooting the vSphere Web Client integration, or make sure that it works, with a lot of hits and a lot of views. I think, if you sort that based on the views, if that's possible, the most important one is the one about the vSphere Web Client integration. And if you use that, make sure that your workflows are usable. So make sure that you only create workflows with only these input parameters you really want to ask the user for. Besides this, you can use whatever workflow you want. You can map them to the different objects in the vSphere Web Client. And it's a very powerful thing to start the workflows from there, especially for, we talked about at the beginning of the session about the different user groups of VCO, especially for the vSphere administrators, of course, because they use VCO day-to-day. They use the vSphere Web Client day-to-day anyway. So it's very nice to let them use the vSphere Web Client also to call out to VCO workflows.
Excellent. Do you have time for another question?
Yeah,
or,
I have.
Should I just? Okay. So Josh has a question. Is there any plan on consolidating the 4 different management links and usernames for the appliance? And I believe he's probably referring to the root VMware and VMware.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So when we talk about the appliance, I think there are some blog articles out there as well that explain that. There are different usernames. The reason for that is we, of course, have the Linux users that you have for the Linux-based appliance, of course, but VCO. So when let me close my Orchestrator client, and let me start my Orchestrator client again. When I log in here, these are users that come from the LDAP installation that runs on the Orchestrator server. And so this is a different user, which is per default called VCO admin. Usually in a production environment, you do not use the open LDAP that is bundled with the Orchestrator appliance, but you bind that to either single sign-on, and then you use your domain users or single sign-on users, or you can use it, or you can configure Orchestrator to connect to an external LDAP or Active Directory, and then you use the users there. But I see the pain.
All right.
or the confusion, let's say it this way.
Yeah. Josh, I hope that answers your question. All right. I think that's it. We should go ahead and call it, because we don't want to keep Joerg up all night long. But thank you very much, everyone. We will see you next week, Wednesday, March 26th. And again, just a small reminder, please go to professionalvmware.com and take our social media /career survey. It's also at bit.ly/vBrownbag survey, all lowercase letters. So Thank you very much, Joerg and Cody, for your hosting behind the scenes and for your, some of your Twitter work. And we will talk to you folks next week. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.